So let's begin with the latest out of Ukraine. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has advocated massive funding for Ukraine to help rebuild after the devastation brought on by the Russian invasion. Speaking to German Parliament today, Mr. Scholz said reconstruction would be a task for generations. He cited the US initiative to help Western Europe rebuild after World War II and said he had invited President Volodymyr Zelensky to participate in the G7 summit starting Sunday. Meanwhile, the International Energy Agency says Russia may cut off gas to Europe entirely as it seeks to bolster its political leverage amid the crisis in Ukraine. IEA Chief Fatih Birol said this in a statement in which he added that he would not rule out Russia continuing to find different issues to find excuses to further reduce gas deliveries to Europe and maybe even cut it off completely. And Russia says it's exchanging official signals on the issue of American fighters in Ukraine, though Russia says it did not see Washington's readiness to deal with the issue seriously. But of course, there's Lithuania's President Gitanas Nausėda, who's saying his country will be prepared if Russia disconnects it from the regional power grid in retaliation for blocking rail shipments of some Russian goods to Moscow's Kaliningrad enclave. But no military confrontation is expected. He said this after the Kremlin warned Lithuania on Tuesday Moscow would respond to the ban on the transit of goods sanctioned by the EU to Kaliningrad in such a way that citizens of the Baltic states will feel the pain. With relations between Moscow and the West at a half-century low over Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Lithuania banned the transit of goods sanctioned by the European Union across its territory to and from Kaliningrad, citing EU sanction rules. Kaliningrad is sandwiched between NATO members Poland and Lithuania and supplied by rail via the territory of Lithuania. Lithuania shut the route for transport of steel and other ferrous metals from mainland Russia on Saturday, saying it had to do so under EU sanctions that took effect that day. Ukrainian troops are withdrawing from the outskirts of Severodonetsk, the city of Luhansk, while using butterfly mines to hinder the movement of Russian forces and pro-Russian militants. Local militia members are telling those on the ground. Now, at present, 80% of Severodonetsk is controlled by Chechen special forces and Luhansk militia forces who are shrinking the encirclement of the key stronghold of the Azot chemical plant. At the same time, Ukraine says the Azot plant does not have an air raid shelter like the Azov steel plant. Currently, about 300 civilians are trapped in the plant. Ukraine has asked Russia to open a humanitarian corridor and evacuate the trapped people of Lysychansk. A battle around the plant has become complicated as Ukrainian forces are taking advantage of the lakes to the southeast of the plant to hold on, with high possibility of receiving replenishments. Large-scale forest fire, probably caused by the exchange of artillery fire, has also made a situation quite precarious. But Ukrainian Defense Ministry today released a video of what it said was a serviceman calling a Minigrad on the wheels. Text accompanying the video said Ukrainian military captured Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter and separated rocket launch units from the helicopter body and then placed it in the open back of the pickup truck. That video, which we hope to show you, you would find Ukrainian servicemen firing makeshift rocket launchers from various locations said to be in Kherson region. But China's deputy permanent representative to the UN, Dai Bing, is calling on certain countries to stop adding fuel to the flame and creating antagonism in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as it will bring greater division, he says, and turmoil to the world, and it serves no one's interests. On Tuesday, United Nations Security Council held another open session on the Ukraine issue with the theme of combating hate speech and incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. Dai Bing called on certain countries not to add fuel to the flame of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, as such behavior will cause more antagonism in the international community and it will lead the world to greater division and turmoil. The envoy said the increase in casualties and displacement in Ukraine, a result of the nearly 4-month-long conflict, are deplorable. He's appealing to all parties to abide by humanitarian law and facilitate evacuation and humanitarian access. The international community and humanitarian agencies should continue to increase humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainian people, he says, and make every effort to mitigate the damage caused by the conflict. Let's bring an international affairs commentator, Adam Roosevelt. He's in the United Arab Emirates. Adam, great to see you, and I appreciate your joining us this evening. And let's just begin, with some of these comments, that are trailing, that are online today. First of all, the Chinese Deputy Permanent Representative calling on all parties to stop adding fuel to fire. China's been rather silent, during this invasion of Ukraine by Russia. What do you think its role has been, while it stands on the sidelines? Because we know that they have been, playing puppet master behind the scenes.
Well, first I'll say it's good to be with you. And as we continue unpackaging this, we have had a lot of activity to the point of China's position. They will continue to remain strategic because their role is to be in their objective to be a liaison, a mediator between the multiple parties, because they're about the economic relations for China long term in their strategic plan, which they were on track to outpace the United States, and they are still trying to do that. This conflict has slowed these things down, but they will position themselves to be a liaison between these multiple parties.
And that is how China does operate, isn't it? They don't get involved directly in a crisis, but they stand on the sidelines and they ask countries to talk. They ask for, interventions, diplomacy, discussions taking place. How come they haven't encouraged much of that, in this since this war started?
Well, I think that their Belt and Road Initiative showcases what their ultimate objective is, which is really centered on the economic power that they effectively control with strategic investments. There's also another side of CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and it's their intelligence side. They do operate similar to how the Central Intelligence Agency operates, and as well as the UK intelligence agencies. And it is about positioning, and in this particular objective, they are about positioning themselves in the middle. So they're going to remain quiet and effectively push the buttons where they can to put themselves as the mediator, to emerge as one of the leading voices as a mediating party.
A prime position it must be. And how serious do you think this ban that Lithuania has placed on some goods coming into Kaliningrad could impact on the war in Ukraine? Russia is infuriated by the move already.
Well, I will tell you that President Putin has already worked with his cabinet ministers, his officials, to look at the supply chain. And one of the first things that he would have done is looked at the traditional supply routes and also looked to create new non-traditional supply routes, which he could leverage smuggling routes, which isn't often discussed. But the governor of Kaliningrad has stated that 40 to 50% of the import and export of goods coming through that location to Russia would be impacted. But I think President Putin is a strategist, and he understands that he would need to redraw the lines of supply chain and the routes to make sure he has a strong position from a supply chain perspective.
But he's threatened Lithuania. Do you think, they can be absolved, or, the European Union or NATO could absolve them, from Russia's wrath?
Well, I think that Russia wants to make sure that these parties don't continue to encroach further and impact their ability to oppress the Ukrainians further. So I think that they're going to threaten with cutting this Lithuania from the power grid, the common power grid. And that's going to be one of the major threats. The EU and NATO is very limited based on what else they can do today outside of sanctions, outside of supplies to the Ukraine. They've used every tool in their arsenal today. So I think right now, Russia does have a position that they can take beyond just the threats of energy grid, cutting them off from that. They can ask OPEC as well as the UAE, India, and the Eastern allies to put some unconventional pressure on this particular party.
I'm glad you mentioned the issue of sanctions because we've been watching from here and haven't seen much impact they've had on Russia. In fact, Russia says the West is trying to isolate the country, but the West is suffering the more, from these sanctions it's imposing on Russia. Uh, so do you think, that there are any other moves, that the West could take on Russia, could probably force its hand to eventually stop this war?
Honestly, I think that they've played the best hand, the West, and from the NATO ally perspective and from the European Union perspective, really one and the same in terms of coalition and strategizing. But I would say that they've played the best tools they've had available, which unfortunately the Ukrainians are running out of time, even with the dedication of money, resources, intelligence. They don't have the capability to hold back the Russian offensive forever. You know, as well as I know, that some recent figures were published in terms of how much Russia occupies the Ukraine. Last week, the number was 20%. I think Putin is going to go for 30 to 35%, expanding eastward and taking larger parts of the Donbass region. But I do think that Russia's on track to move in a direction of more control and occupation.
And now leaders are looking to the future for Ukraine, discussing reconstruction, rebuilding. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz compared this to after the Second World War. Are there really similarities here? Do you think Ukraine would get the same treatment as those other nations back then?
It depends on the use case scenario. Following World War II, for example, the conditions were very different. The investor, if you will, had a lot of control on the future of the country's state because it was so degraded that people were in a position where they were going to be very dependent on a foreign host. In this particular case, they're not going to, in the foreseeable future, join NATO. They're not in the foreseeable future, potentially even going to be able to join the European Union. So there will be a very difficult conversation about investing into a region that is not a part of a membership. And I think the Reconstruction era will have major challenges that have not been addressed, but we won't be able to address that until this war is over.
Wow. And this war is entering another phase. Ukraine wants more weapons, as you rightly mentioned earlier. They want long-range rockets. Russia's hitting on more territories. How clear is this special military operation that Russia is taking on in Ukraine, and what the plan, what the end game is for the Russian government?
Well, I think the end game phase number one was to destabilize the region and cause as much havoc. And the way you do that is you strike strategic infrastructure across multiple industries, construction, real estate, military locations. They have been very successful in carrying out infrastructure degradation in terms of strikes. Now we're entering the phase where Russia is looking to expand eastward, take larger parts of the Donbass region. And as I mentioned, 30%, 35% of occupation is probably the target. And that effectively puts Putin in a very different position where he would have on the chessboard put Zelensky in a position where he's going to have to make some concessions, I would say discreetly, working with Washington to bring this to a position of agreement, or else Putin will ramp up his aggressive strategy, which would potentially put Ukraine in a position of no recovery in the future. So I think now is the time to start looking at diplomatic ways. And other strategists also agree with me as well, who've made statements that this war will not last years. We're approaching a time frame where, unfortunately, resources are not making it to the front lines. They will not be able to hold out.
You say the war will not last years, like the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has alluded to. I think it was this week on Sunday that he said that. But the position of the United States in this, the U.S. wants to approach things diplomatically, but yet they're supplying Ukraine weapons. And that's a bit confusing, for the Russian government. They're saying you want peace in Ukraine, but you're still supplying weapons. How does this line of diplomacy work, and what could be the result?
Well, it's very limited diplomacy tools on the table when you're in the position where you're funding and sending weapons that are effectively killing Russian citizens, Russian military troops from Putin's perspective. So the U.S. diplomatic position is very limited because now the U.S. is on a strong, aggressive footing with Russia. So I think that that's the largest issue we're going to see. But what I think Russia now has to do is prove themselves in terms of winning the war, and I think that is done through measurable things like larger occupation, 35%. But NATO is in no position diplomatically. I will say this lastly on this is that I think the UAE and the GCC would potentially be the right liaison and mediator in this role, not China per se, but the GCC and UAE, because they are a neutral party. And I think that they could take a larger role in bringing this to a halt.
It does kind of make sense. You would need neutral powers to intervene, probably why China is calling for everyone to stop adding fuel to the fire. Let's talk about the man himself, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. Many have criticized, well, many analysts, I must say, have criticized the way he's handled events leading to the war and then throughout the war, and say he probably made a mistake taking on Russia. What do you say?
Well, I will tell you from my professional and the intelligence world that I come from with a military background, I think what he has learned about being a neighbor to Russia is leveraging certain tools that Russia would leverage to gain a larger position around the globe. And he bet that this would be backed by the United States and the European Union and NATO powers. And he moves forward with this. And now he's campaigning globally. He's become a celebrity, if you will. And after this, he will be renowned or known as a leading figure in the world. So I think he's played his cards strategically, but I think militarily on the ground, when we assess the damage that is done and really the truth about winning the war, I don't believe that they have the capacity and the capability to win. So he has to gamble and he has to fold at a specific point in time, or he will lose the gamble entirely.
Do you think he's losing already?
Well, I think from a public relations perspective, he has gained a lot of notoriety. But from an infrastructure and governance perspective, I think that he has lost more than he is willing to admit, because now it's about the patriotism behind the person leading the campaign. Because if you lose and surrender, then everything you've gained in this war would effectively be revoked. And it's an embarrassing position to be in, because now what is next? It's subjugation.
Thank you so much, Adam. Appreciate your analysis this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you.